Hello, my name's Katie Lewis and I'm the head of MFL at Pearson EdXL. In this short video, we're going to be taking a look at the dictation. So first of all, let's take a look at the details of the construction of the dictation, starting with the foundation tier. So the dictation opens with an introductory sentence explaining what the subject of the dictation is, because all of the dictations will always be kind of linked around a particular theme, in this case music. Then there is an example which is also related to that same theme, so it doesn't confuse the learners at all, and it shows them how the gap fill questions work. Then you've got on your foundation tier your 3 gap fill questions. Question 1 contains 2 gaps, and the words which are missing from those 2 gaps will both come from the vocabulary list. Then in sentences 2 and 3, there are also 2 gaps. One of those gaps will have a word which is taken from the vocabulary list, and the other gap will have a word that comes from outside of the vocabulary list. So remember that although the vast majority of vocabulary on the qualification in the reading and the listening comes from the vocabulary list, there are those 2 exceptions, aren't there? There's the inference questions, the single word inference questions in the reading, and there is the off vocabulary list words in the dictation. So there are 2 in the foundation tier. They are both part of the gap fill and they will occur in sentences 2 and 3. Then for sentences 4, 5 and 6, those are your completing of a full sentence. So you're ramping up the demand a little bit there. So these are prefaced with a second example that shows the student what they have to do. And then you've got your 3 open sentences, all of which contain words that only come from the vocabulary list. So here's a little bit more detail then about the construction of the transcripts that the learners are going to listen to for their dictation assessment. So for the foundation tier, there will be 20 words that the students have to transcribe. That doesn't include the words which are already printed on the page. There'll be 3 gap fills and 3 full sentences, as we've just seen in our example. If we use proper nouns, then that will be done minimally, that's the first thing to say, only if we need to include them to make the sentence cohesive. That could include names of people or places or that kind of thing. However, those proper nouns will not be part of the words that the students are required to transcribe unless those proper nouns are actually already part of the vocabulary list. Because remember, you have got 30 cultural words, which includes the names of places, on the vocabulary list. So if one of those might appear in the dictation, it could be one of the accessible words. No other proper noun would appear in an accessible position in the dictation. So if you had a job writing dictations for EdXL, then these are the instructions that we would give to you as part of the work you would be doing. So we're going to share them with you as well for complete transparency on that. The writers are told that the dictation for the foundation tier here, it can be presented in the present tense or using a familiar conditional tense. It could use an immediate future. It could use a future time frame, such as the example we've got here, tomorrow I'm going to the park, and it will be presented in the first and third person singular with verbs, and we will try for French to avoid on where possible. That one is a little bit of a challenge in and of itself, isn't it? Now, the other thing which is really important to note about the dictation is that grammar is not assessed in the dictation. So we will come on a later slide to talk about what that means in practice, but it is quite important because it means that there is for your learners a safety net so that if they correctly render the sound symbol correspondence in a way which is a valid sound symbol correspondence in that language, but happens to be the wrong one for a grammatical reason, they would potentially still get the credit, assuming that it meets all of the other creditable criteria. So let's have a look at the higher tier in a bit more detail now. So again, you've got the introductory rubric. I'm sure you've noticed that it's in English, that explains the subject of the dictation, in this case food, and you've got your linked example that shows them what the requirements of the assessment are. Then, unlike the foundation tier, here you've got two gap fill questions on the higher tier, both of which contain 3 gaps. In sentence number 1, 2 of the 3 gaps are filled with words from the vocabulary list, and 1 of the 3 gaps is filled with a word that comes from outside of the vocabulary list. That, as I mentioned, is a requirement for the new GCSE, that they essentially render in writing correctly a spelling of a word that they haven't previously memorized. So they are applying that sound symbol correspondence simply based on the sound that they hear. Sentence 2 has 3 gaps as well. Now, 1 of those words is a word from the vocabulary list, and 2 of those words are words from outside of the vocabulary list. So that brings you to 3 words from outside of the vocabulary list in total, and that is all of the non-vocab list words on the higher tier. Then, just like we do in the foundation tier, but with a slightly different ratio of gap fills to full sentences, we move on to the full sentence transcription for questions 3, 4, 5, and 6. So these are all open sentences, and they are all words from the vocabulary list. And as we're ramping up the demand towards the end of the dictation activity, sentences 5 and 6 may themselves be longer, be a bit more demanding in terms of the grammatical structures that they contain. So let's have a look at the detail of the higher tier then. So 30 words for the students to transcribe on the higher tier, so 10 more than the foundation tier, and that ratio as well is different, so 2 gap fills and 4 full sentences. However, the approach to proper nouns and the approach to grammar that we've just talked about for the foundation tier is actually the same between the foundation tier and the higher tier. So the differentiation for the higher tier comes in with the number of words they have to describe, the ratio of gap fills to full sentences, obviously the number of unknown words not on the vocabulary list. There's 3 on the higher tier versus 2 on the foundation tier. And then for Spanish only, which we're going to look at on the next slide, there is a higher tier only expectation around the assessments of accents. So let's move on and have a look at that. So as I mentioned, there is a specific requirement as part of the SSC's section of the subject criteria for Spanish that students are assessed on stress positions and associated spelling rules. So that's a direct quotation there from the subject content. And that is obviously going to have an impact on both the read aloud and the dictation. So in the read aloud, we've looked at that, how it's marked holistically overall, but part of the expectation around the read aloud is that the students will be applying stress appropriately to those syllables that have a written accent. So you've got 3 examples there of where the relative stress for the higher tier for Spanish would be something that was incorporated into the assessment. For the dictation, it's about where the students will include accents when they are transcribing what they've heard. So you can see the 3 examples there of what a student would be expected to do in order for that word that they had transcribed to be creditable in the dictation. Now, we know, of course, therefore, that this could be something which is a particular challenge for Spanish, which doesn't actually exist in the German and the French assessments. So we do have to assess it because it is part of the subject criteria. However, we want to minimize any additional demand that might create for the Spanish higher tier learners. So we will only be including 2 words in our dictation for which the stressed syllable is indicated by an accent. So even though it is something that they have to do, it won't have an overwhelming, overpowering effect on the demand of the dictation for your Spanish higher tier students. So we've talked about words which are creditworthy or creditable, I think I've been saying for the past couple of slides. So let's spend a bit of time now looking at the mark scheme. We have developed for the dictation a mark scheme which is compassionate in that it acknowledges that in sometimes quite a few examples, the same sound can be accurately rendered in different ways. What we will then do in the dictation is we will tick all of the words that the student has transcribed which are rewardable, and we will convert the number of ticks into a final mark out of 10. So you'll see there on the foundation tier, if a student achieves 19 or 20 ticks, they get 10 out of 10. So even for full marks, there is a tiny bit of wiggle room there. You're not requiring 100% perfection. They can make a slip up. On the higher tier, if they get 28, 29 or 30 ticks, they will get 10 marks out of 10. So the big question then becomes, well, what words are rewardable? Which words can I tick so that I know how many ticks my learner has got and I can add them up to get the appropriate mark? So any word which is rewardable is a word which is correctly spelt. Those are the really easy ones, okay? If the word is correctly spelt, it gets a tick. That should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway just to be 100% sure. Words which are grammatically inaccurate, but that grammatical inaccuracy doesn't have any impact on the pronunciation. So if the student hears deux maisons, two houses, and they write de maison without the S. So essentially what they've written is to house. Now, maison and maison sound exactly the same whether you render the S or not. So this is a grammatical error, and the student would get the tick for maison without the S because they have correctly rendered in the target language an appropriate spelling of that sound. The mistake that they have made is a grammatical one, not one that's associated with the sound symbol correspondence, which is what is being assessed. Another example here, if the student writes je veux with a T, meaning I want, instead of je veux with an X, which also means want, obviously, there is no difference in the sound of those words. The difference that they have rendered there is a grammatical inaccuracy, that they have misconjugated the verb. So that would also be ticked. Where you can think of other examples that the sound is the same, but the difference it renders is a grammatical one, then in those circumstances where the word is still recognizable, it's not so poorly rendered that it's become nonsensical, then they would get the tick. Now, I think it's probably worthwhile thinking of that as a safety net. If I was marking dictations in the process of teaching and learning, and students were making grammatical mistakes such as this, I might not tick it because I don't want them to think it's fine to write whatever, because in the writing exam it's not fine to write whatever. And also, of course, overall we want them to be communicating accurately, and we want them to be conjugating correctly where they need to do that. But what it means is, in the stress of the exam situation where they might make a slip up, or they might be thinking, gosh, is it AIS or AIT in the example that they listen to? Is it A or A? They sound the same. Which one is it? I can't remember. They can write down one of them and be confident that, assuming it meets the other rewardable criteria, that in and of itself would not be something that would prevent them from being rewarded for what they had put. The other thing that will be rewarded are words which are incorrectly spelt, but that doesn't have any impact on the pronunciation, and where the word is still recognizable. So what they've written isn't nonsense. You would be able to lift out that word and think, oh, well, that's obviously the word adore. It's just that the student has spelt it with two Ds. This is only the case for French and German, because in Spanish, the double consonants like this, you would actually pronounce both of them. So adore and spargel, in German and French, they both sound the same, irrespective of the fact that there is a small spelling error that the student has made. We have to then ask ourselves, as well as the examples that we've just talked about on the previous slides, what types of errors or misspellings might be rewardable for each language, because there are going to be some language specific idiosyncrasies. So here, and this is taken from the mark schemes which are in the sample assessment materials for French, German and Spanish, and I would encourage you to go onto the Edexcel website and familiarise yourself with the categories for each language. But let's look at these together first of all. So for Spanish, we are acknowledging that there are some different ways of spelling a word, even though that difference in the spelling has no impact on the sound symbol correspondence accuracy. So they create essentially common misspellings that don't change the pronunciation of the word. And if a student falls into the category of a common misspelling that doesn't change the pronunciation of the word, that word would still be rewardable. So you've got your examples here of the B and the V, which are, from a sound perspective, essentially interchangeable, and you can see the other examples for Spanish there. If a student was to spell the word that should contain B's with V's and vice versa, they would be credited for their rendering of that word. For French, we've already looked at on the previous slide the examples like je veux, de maison, and we've also looked at things like double consonants. There would also be examples such as the one you can see here, where the students have added a letter, but that letter has been added in such a way that the word pronunciation still remains exactly as it would have been without the addition of that letter. So we've got the example here of sœur, with the addition of an E on the end. It makes no difference to how that word is pronounced, and it is still clearly recognizable as the word it is supposed to be, even if you lifted it from the sentence in which you found it. For German, we essentially have the similar application of what is rewardable to what we've talked about for French. So the word itself still has to be recognizable, but we also have to be mindful of the fact that the same sound can be spelt in more than one way in some cases. So here we've got the T and the D at the end of the word sint and sint, which in fact are pronounced the same whether you spelled it with the D or the T. And we've talked about the use of double consonants, which technically is incorrect from a spelling perspective, but it's exactly the same in terms of the sound, and the word remains recognizable in its own right. So let's look now at words which are not rewardable for each language, because obviously there is going to be a limit beyond which it's actually not possible to give that word a tick. So for both German and French, where the spelling is wrong, because the sound symbol correspondence has been incorrectly applied, then it does not get a tick. And what we're essentially applying here is an ear test. So the word might actually look very similar to how it's supposed to look. So we've got the example here for French. The student has written violin instead of violon. Now, they look very similar. You would recognize that the word that the student is trying to render there is violin. However, this is an assessment of the correct rendering of a viable sound symbol correspondence, and if you were to read the word aloud exactly as the student has spelled it, not as they wanted to spell it or not as you think they were trying to spell it, but exactly as they have spelt it, if it doesn't sound like it's supposed to sound in the target language, it is not rewardable. And that's the same rule for German and for French. The second rule is words which are written phonetically and may possibly contain some appropriate sound symbol correspondences, but are so inaccurately spelt that they essentially become unrecognizable if you were to look at them in isolation outside of the context of the sentence which the student was writing. So we've got an example here for gâteau. The student was trying to write the French word for cake, and they have essentially written it as though it were an English word that they were trying to write down, G-A-T-T-O, gâteau. Now, technically it might pass the ear test. You might see a word that the student has written and you could read it off the page and it sounds like the word. However, if you just looked at that word in isolation outside of the context in which it had been originally heard by the student, I don't think, even with the most sympathetic French person in the world, are they going to recognize, without hearing it, that G-A-T-T-O is supposed to be gâteau. It's so far from being accurate that it is essentially unrecognizable. So we're applying an ear test and an eye test. Does what the student has rendered, when I read it back off the page, sound like the word it's supposed to be? And then secondly, if I simply look at the word on the page and I imagine I'm looking at it in isolation, is it recognizable to me that that is a word in the target language? If the answer to either of those is no, then the word cannot get ticked, it is not rewardable, and it wouldn't be one of the words that the student would have to contribute to their final mark. So let's have a look at the Spanish as well. So we've got exactly the same rule around words which are unrewardable in Spanish, as we've already talked about for French and German, which is the word might look recognizable on the page, but because they have incorrectly applied a sound symbol correspondence, if you were to read it exactly as written, it wouldn't sound identical to the word it's supposed to sound like. And you can see a range of Spanish examples there. Additionally, for Spanish, students would not be rewarded if they have doubled up on consonants where that doubling actually creates an impact on what sound symbol correspondence is being rendered. So the use of a double L instead of a single L, the use of a double R instead of a single R, for example. We've also got the same information that we looked at for German and French in terms of misspellings, which are essentially phonetically transcribed, possibly phonetically transcribed as if you were trying to write it in English sound system, but may, either by luck or by knowledge, contain some correct sound symbol correspondences, but the word itself is rendered so phonetically that is unrecognizable in its own right. Those are not rewardable, just like German and French. And then finally, for the higher tier only, as per the slide that we looked at, we do have to assess the students conspicuously on their application of accents to indicate stress positions. So if a word has an accent and the student does not include that accent or does not include that accent in the right place, it is not rewardable. And if a student equally adds an accent to a word which doesn't have one, then that is not rewardable either. But just to remind you, the number of examples in the dictation, in the higher tier only, where stress accents will actively be assessed is only 2. So it won't be something which will be particularly overpowering of the dictation more broadly, but it is something that students do need to be aware of, and they are going to be actively assessed on that in 2 words on the higher tier. Thank you for listening to our pre-recorded training on applying the dictation mark scheme and understanding the requirements of the dictation. We hope you found it useful, and we'll see you in our next video.